The sound of shattering glass echoed like a ghostly whisper through the alley. Mateo Herrera stopped dead in his tracks, his heart beating so loud he could hear it over the icy wind that cut through the city like a razor. His hands, numb from the cold, trembled as he cautiously approached the source of the noise. It was a beer bottle that had fallen from a third-floor window. The green fragments glittered under the weak light of a street lamp that flickered intermittently, creating dancing shadows on the graffiti-covered walls. Mateo sighed with relief. It was just trash, like him. At 23 years old, Mateo had already spent 5 years living on the streets of a city that seemed to have forgotten his name. His face, once young and full of hope, now showed the invisible scars of someone who had lost everything, the empty gaze of someone who had stopped dreaming, the premature wrinkles of someone who had aged too fast, and that hunched posture of someone carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. His clothes were a collage of desperation, a leather jacket that had once been black but was now an indefinable color, full of patches and mends he had made himself with thread he found in dumpsters. His jeans, more whole than fabric, barely protected him from the cold. His shoes, without laces and with soles almost completely detached, had walked more miles than any footwear should endure. But it was December, and December in that city was merciless. The thermometer had hit -5 degrees that morning, and now, past midnight, the temperature had dropped even further. The north wind brought with it the promise of snow, and Mateo knew that if he didn't find shelter soon, this could be his last night. It had been 3 days since he'd eaten anything solid. His last feast had been half a sandwich he found in the dumpster behind an office building, and even that he'd had to share with the rats. His stomach no longer growled with hunger, it had moved past that phase. Now there was only a constant emptiness, a persistent reminder that his body was consuming itself. As he walked through the deserted streets, Mateo remembered how he had gotten there. It hadn't happened overnight. It never does. It all began when he was 18. His mother, Carmen, had been his entire universe. She worked as a housekeeper in wealthy families' homes during the day, and at night she cleaned offices to earn extra money. She never complained, never lacked a smile or a word of encouragement for her son. "Mateo, my love," she would tell him while preparing breakfast before leaving for work, "life is going to hit us many times, but what matters isn't how many times we fall, but how many times we get back up." Those words echoed in his mind now as his numb feet carried him automatically along routes he knew by heart. Survival routes he had memorized during years of aimless wandering. Carmen had died of cancer on a rainy Tuesday in April. They didn't have health insurance, and by the time they managed to scrape together the money to take her to the hospital, it was too late. Mateo vividly remembered how his mother had squeezed his hand in that public hospital bed, her sunken eyes still full of love. "Promise me you'll be happy," she had whispered in a broken voice. "Promise me you'll find your place in this world." Mateo had promised, but breaking that promise had been easier than he ever imagined. After the funeral, which he paid for by selling everything they had of value, which wasn't much, Mateo tried to keep the apartment where they had lived. He worked at a textile factory on the night shift, earning barely enough to cover rent and eat once a day. But the factory closed 6 months later. The owners said it was cheaper to produce in other countries. Without work, without money, without family, Mateo fell behind on rent. The landlord, a fat man with small, cruel eyes, gave him a week to catch up. When he couldn't do it, the man arrived with 2 large men who threw his few belongings onto the street and changed the locks. "Nothing personal, kid," the landlord told him as Mateo watched his last memories of his mother scattered on the sidewalk. "It's business." That was the first night Mateo slept on the street. He had thought it would be temporary. That he would get another job, save money, and soon be back in an apartment. But life on the streets has a particular way of swallowing people. Each day that passed without a fixed address, without a place to shower, without clean clothes, made it harder to get work. Employers looked at him with suspicion, his increasingly unkempt appearance made them turn away before he could explain his situation. At first, he slept in parks or on the stairs of abandoned buildings. He quickly learned that the best places to sleep were those that were hidden but not too isolated, because in places too lonely you could be attacked, but in places too visible the police would kick you out. He also learned that food could be obtained in ways he had never imagined. Restaurants threw away perfectly edible food at the end of the day. Supermarkets discarded products that were 1 day from their expiration date. If your timing was good and you were lucky, you could find real treasures in garbage containers. But the hardest thing of all wasn't hunger or cold. It was invisibility. At first, Mateo tried to make eye contact with people walking down the street. He smiled, greeted them, tried to maintain his humanity. But little by little, he realized that for most people, he simply didn't exist. He could stand on a corner for hours, and people would walk around him as if he were a lamppost. Some looked at him with disgust, others with fear. Very few with compassion. And that compassion, when it appeared, often came accompanied by a coin thrown from a safe distance, without eye contact, without recognition that he was a person with a story, with broken dreams, with a heart that still beat. Over time, Matteo stopped trying to make eye contact. He stopped smiling at strangers. He hunched over, kept his head down, and learned to move through the city like a shadow. It was easier that way. It hurt less. Winters were the worst. The first one almost killed him. He didn't know how to stay warm, where to find shelter when temperatures dropped so low that breath turned into ice crystals. He learned by trial and error, and some of those errors almost cost him his life. Now it was his 5th winter on the streets, and he had developed survival strategies that worked most of the time. He knew which buildings had heating that filtered through ventilation grates. He knew the schedules of temporary shelters, although they were always full and you had to wait in line for hours to get a spot. He knew where to get large, sturdy cardboard to make improvised walls against the wind. But that night was different. The cold was more intense than normal, and Matteo had lost his usual refuge. A group of young people had decided that the hollow under the bridge where he slept was the perfect place to make a bonfire and drink. When he arrived, he found broken bottles, empty cans, and the remains of a fire that had burned much of his cardboard furniture. Now he walked aimlessly, looking for any place where he could spend the night without freezing. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, and he had lost feeling in his feet more than an hour ago. He knew these were dangerous signs, but what options did he have? That's when he saw her. At first he thought it was a garbage bag. She was sitting in the doorway of an abandoned building, so motionless she seemed to be part of the architecture. But when he got closer, he realized it was a person. An older woman, very old. Her hair was completely white, long and disheveled by the wind. Her skin had that grayish tone that Matteo had learned to recognize as a danger sign. She was dressed in what had once been elegant clothes, a wool coat that, although dirty and torn, had clearly been expensive. Her shoes, although worn, were genuine leather. But what struck him most were her hands. They were delicate, with long, thin fingers that suggested a life that hadn't always been difficult. On one of her fingers, barely visible under the dirt, something that appeared to be a gold ring glinted weakly. "Ma'am?" Matteo whispered, approaching cautiously. She didn't respond. For a terrible moment, he thought she might be dead. It wouldn't be the first time he had found a body on the streets. The cold took the most vulnerable every winter, and authorities often took days to find the bodies. "Ma'am?" he repeated, this time a little louder. The woman slowly opened her eyes. They were a faded blue, like the sky on cloudy days, and for a moment they seemed not to focus on anything. Then they looked directly at him, and Matteo saw something in them that startled him: recognition. Not of him specifically, but of the situation. She knew exactly where she was and why. "I'm cold," she said in a voice that was barely a whisper, but carried the weight of years of sadness. "Very cold." Matteo looked around. The building where the old woman was sitting had all its windows boarded up. The doors were closed with thick chains and padlocks. It was clear it had been abandoned for years. There was nowhere they could take shelter there. The street was completely deserted. There was no traffic, no pedestrians, no one else who could help. Just the two of them, two castaways in an ocean of concrete and indifference. Without thinking twice, Matteo took off his jacket. It was the only thing separating him from the deadly cold of that night, but when he saw the old woman's blue lips and the way her body trembled uncontrollably, he knew she needed it more than he did. Maybe it was because she reminded him of his mother in her last days, or maybe it was because he had gone so long without doing something genuinely good that he had forgotten how it felt. "Here," he said, carefully wrapping the jacket around her frail shoulders. The cold hit him immediately like a punch. His t-shirt, full of holes and stains, offered no protection against the icy wind. Within seconds, his muscles began to contract violently, and his teeth started chattering so hard he thought they were going to break. But the look of gratitude in the old woman's eyes was worth more than any coat. "You can't stay here," he told her, offering his arm to help her stand. "I know a place." The old woman weighed less than he had expected. Her bones felt like dry branches under her skin, and Matteo had to make a conscious effort not to squeeze her too tight for fear of hurting her. When he finally managed to get her to her feet, he realized she barely reached his shoulder. She was a very small woman, which made her situation even more heartbreaking. They walked slowly through the empty streets. Matteo had developed a particular pace during his years on the streets, fast but not too fast, quiet enough not to draw attention, but determined enough not to seem vulnerable. But now he had to adapt his rhythm to the old woman's, who walked with small, hesitant steps. Every few meters, she stopped to catch her breath. Her breathing was labored, a wheezing sound that suggested lung problems. Mateo began to worry that they wouldn't reach their destination before she collapsed. "What's your name?" he asked as he helped her navigate around a pothole filled with ice. "Elena," the old woman replied in a broken voice. "Elena Vasquez. I'm Mateo. Mateo Herrera." Elena nodded weakly, saving energy for walking. Mateo noticed that despite her condition, there was something in her posture, in the way she spoke, that suggested she hadn't always been homeless. There was an education in her voice, a formality that contrasted with the crude way he and other street dwellers communicated. Mateo's improvised shelter was located under a railway bridge on the outskirts of downtown. It was a place he had discovered during his second winter on the streets, and which he had gradually improved over time. It wasn't much, but it was his. He had built walls with large cardboard boxes he got from behind appliance stores. He had reinforced them with duct tape and plastic bags to make them water-resistant. The roof was a blue tarp he had found at an abandoned construction site, secured with ropes and rocks. Inside, he had created a sort of living room with smaller boxes that served as seats and an improvised table. His bed was an air mattress he had found in a dumpster and repaired with bicycle patches. He had blankets he had accumulated over the years, some donated by charities, others found or traded with other street dwellers. What made him most proud was his small heating system. He had built a brazier with a metal drum he found in a vacant lot. With proper ventilation and fuel he collected during the day, wood, cardboard, anything that could burn, he could keep the space relatively warm even on the coldest nights. "Welcome to my home," he told Elena as he helped her enter the shelter. Elena looked around with eyes that seemed to evaluate every detail. There was no judgment in her gaze, only curiosity and what seemed to be appreciation. "It's cozy," she said finally, and something in her tone let Mateo know she wasn't being condescending. Mateo lit the brazier with newspapers and wood chips he had prepared that morning. The fire caught quickly, and soon the small space filled with blessed warmth. Elena instinctively moved closer to the fire, extending her hands toward the flames as if they were precious jewels. "How long have you lived here?" Elena asked, looking at the details of the shelter that had clearly taken time and effort to create. "About 3 years," Mateo replied as he rummaged through his few possessions. "Before, I slept in different places every night, but this is, well, it's the closest thing to a home I've had in a long time." He found what he was looking for, half a loaf of bread he had gotten that morning behind a bakery. It was hard, but it was food. He broke it in half and offered the larger portion to Elena. "I can't accept this," Elena said, although her hungry eyes contradicted her words. "Of course you can," Mateo insisted. "When was the last time you ate?" Elena thought for a moment, as if she had to make a conscious effort to remember. "Yesterday, no, the day before yesterday. I found some fruit at the market that they were going to throw away." Mateo put the bread in her hands. "Then you definitely need to eat." While Elena ate slowly, carefully chewing each bite, Mateo observed her with growing curiosity. Everything about her was a mystery. Her clothes, although dirty, were of good quality. Her manners, even in her current state, showed refined education. And there was something in her eyes, a depth that suggested a life full of complex experiences. "Do you have family?" Mateo asked, sitting on one of his improvised boxes. The question seemed to hit Elena like a physical punch. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. "I had," she said finally. "My husband died 10 years ago. Lung cancer. He had never smoked a cigarette in his life, but he worked for 30 years in an asbestos factory. The doctors said there was nothing they could do." She paused to take a sip of warm water that Mateo had offered her in a disposable plastic cup. "My son died 5 years ago. Car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit him head-on. Diego was 28 years old. He was going to get married in 3 months." Tears now flowed freely down her cheeks, leaving clean trails on her dirty skin. "After that, I lost myself. I stopped caring about everything. The house, the bills, life. I just stayed in bed, looking at photos of them, wishing I could follow them." Mateo felt a knot in his throat. He knew that kind of pain, that feeling that the world had crumbled and there was no reason to go on. "How did you end up on the street?" he asked gently. Elena wrapped herself more tightly in Mateo's jacket, as if it were a shield against painful memories. "I stopped paying the bills. I stopped eating regularly. I stopped talking to the few friends I had left. The lawyers came after months of notices I ignored. They told me the house had to be sold to pay the debts. Medical debts from my husband, funeral expenses for my son, back taxes. Didn't you have other relatives? I have a sister in another city, but we haven't spoken in years. My parents died long ago. The few cousins I had left, well, when I contacted them for help, suddenly they all had their own problems. It's amazing how people disappear when you really need them. Matteo nodded. He had experienced that same disappearance after his mother's death. The co-workers he had considered friends, the neighbors who had been cordial for years, all had vanished when his life fell apart. When they kicked me out of the house, Elena continued, I didn't know where to go. I had some money from the sale, but not much after paying the debts. I looked for cheap apartments, but they all asked for deposits I couldn't pay, or had waiting lists of months. I stayed in cheap hotels until I ran out of money. How long have you been on the street? 8 months, Elena replied, and the figure surprised them both. It sounded like so much and so little at the same time. The fire crackled softly between them, creating an atmosphere of unexpected intimacy. Matteo realized it had been months since he'd had a real conversation with another person. Most of his interactions were functional, asking for food, avoiding trouble, exchanging basic survival information with other street dwellers. But this was different. Despite the circumstances, or perhaps because of them, he felt a genuine human connection. And you? Elena asked. How did you get here? Matteo didn't usually talk about his story. He had learned that most people didn't really care, and that telling his story over and over only served to keep open wounds he preferred to heal. But something about Elena made him feel safe to share. He told her about his mother, about how she had worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat after his father abandoned them when he was 5 years old. He spoke of the nights when Carmen came home so tired she could barely stand, but still found energy to help him with homework or to listen to how his day had gone. He told her about the cancer, about how they had spent all their savings on treatments that didn't work. About the funeral that only 6 people attended. About the job he lost and the apartment he was evicted from. I'm so sorry, Elena said when he finished. Your mother sounds like an extraordinary woman. She was, Matteo replied, surprised that talking about her didn't hurt as much as he expected. She always said it didn't matter where you came from, but where you were going. Wise words. Yes, although I'm not sure she would be proud of where I ended up. Elena looked directly into his eyes. Why do you say that? Look at me, Matteo said, gesturing toward his torn clothes and improvised shelter. I live under a bridge. I look for food in garbage. I haven't had a job in 5 years. I don't think this is what she had in mind. But you helped me, Elena said simply. You gave me your jacket when I was cold. You brought me to your home and shared your food with me. You're treating me with more kindness than I've received in months. Don't you think that would make her proud? Matteo didn't know what to answer. He had spent so much time seeing his life in terms of what he had lost, what he didn't have, what he hadn't achieved, that he had forgotten he could still choose to be a good person. You're not alone now, Elena told him, echoing the words he had said to her a few hours earlier. And neither am I. They spent the next few hours talking. Elena told him about her life before the tragedy. She had been an elementary school teacher for 30 years. Her husband had been an engineer. They had traveled, had a comfortable middle-class life, had planned a quiet retirement full of grandchildren and hobbies. We had so many plans, Elena said, looking at the fire. Eduardo wanted to build furniture in the garage. I wanted to learn to paint. We were going to visit Diego and his girlfriend every Sunday for lunch. It was a simple life, but it was our life. Matteo told her about his own broken dreams. He had wanted to study automotive mechanics. He had a talent for fixing things, for understanding how machines worked. Before everything fell apart, he had been saving money to take night classes at a technical school. You could still do it, Elena said. At 23 years old, with no address, no money, no job references. I don't think so. My son didn't start college until he was 25, Elena said. He worked for years to save money, then studied civil engineering. He graduated with honors. It's never too late to start over. As they talked, Matteo noticed that Elena was coughing more and more frequently. It was a dry, deep cough that seemed to come from the bottom of her lungs. Each coughing fit left her breathless, and he could see it caused her pain. Are you feeling all right? He asked, although the answer was obvious. I've been coughing for weeks, Elena admitted. I think it's from the cold and dampness. Sleeping outside isn't good for an old woman's lungs. How old are you? if it's not too personal to ask. 74, Elena replied, and Matteo was surprised. He had thought she was older, but he realized that the hardships of street life had aged her prematurely, just as they had happened to him. As the night progressed, Elena's cough got worse. It was no longer just occasional, now it came in violent attacks that doubled her over and left her gasping. Matteo could see spots of blood on the handkerchief she tried to hide. "Elena, you need to see a doctor," Matteo said, although they both knew the complications that would involve. "I don't have identification documents," Elena replied weakly. "I lost them months ago. Without ID, without an address, without health insurance, what hospital is going to treat me?" It was a brutal reality that Matteo knew well. Public hospitals were required to treat emergencies, but a cough, no matter how severe, rarely qualified as an emergency until it was too late. "We could go to the emergency room tomorrow," Matteo suggested. "Say it's an emergency." Elena shook her head. "I've been to hospitals before when I didn't have insurance. They make you wait hours, treat you like you're a burden, and in the end they give you an aspirin and send you home with a bill you can't pay. But if you're really sick..." "Matteo," Elena said, taking his hand with surprising firmness, "I've lived 74 years. I've had a good life for most of that time. If my body is saying it's time to go, maybe I should listen to it." "Don't say that," Matteo replied with a vehemence that surprised him. "You have a right to live, to receive medical help, to be treated with dignity." Elena smiled weakly. "You know what? It's been months since anyone spoke to me like I was a real person. Everyone treats me like I'm a problem to solve or something to avoid. But you see me." The words touched something deep in Matteo. He knew exactly what she meant. Invisibility was one of the most painful parts of living on the streets. As the night moved toward dawn, Elena fell asleep curled up near the fire, wrapped in Matteo's jacket and covered with the best blanket he had. Matteo stayed awake, feeding the fire and watching her sleep. Her breathing was labored and irregular. From time to time she woke up coughing, violent attacks that shook her whole body. Matteo gave her water, gently rubbed her back, and calmed her until she went back to sleep. Sometime in the early morning, as he watched the flames dance in the brazier, Matteo realized something important. For the first time in years, he felt useful. He wasn't just a burden, he wasn't just someone who took resources without giving anything back. He was taking care of someone, and that gave him a purpose he had forgotten he could feel. When the sun began to rise, painting the sky pink and orange, Elena woke up slowly. Her color was worse than the night before, and Matteo noticed it was harder for her to breathe. "Good morning," she said with a weak smile. "Good morning. How are you feeling?" Elena tried to sit up, but the effort left her breathless. "I've been better," she admitted, trying to make a joke, but her voice sounded hoarse and weak. Matteo approached and noticed her forehead was hot. She had a fever, and that, combined with the cough and difficulty breathing, worried him deeply. "Elena, we have to get you to the hospital. Now." "No, please," she murmured, grabbing his arm with surprising strength for someone in her condition. "I don't want to die in a cold hospital, surrounded by strangers. If it's going to happen, I'd rather it be here, with someone who cares about me." The words hit Matteo like a punch. "You're not going to die. I won't allow it." "Matteo, my dear boy," Elena said, and there was a serenity in her voice that scared him more than her panic would have. "At my age, with my health, after months on the streets, my body is tired. Very tired. But you have so much to live for still. We can get help, find a way off the streets, start over." Elena smiled with infinite sadness. "You know what's been the best thing about these last terrible months? Meeting you. Remembering that kindness still exists in the world." Matteo felt tears running down his cheeks. He hadn't cried in years, he had built emotional walls so high he thought nothing could penetrate them. But something about Elena, about her quiet dignity in the midst of suffering, had torn down those defenses. "Listen to me carefully," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper but full of urgency. "In the inside pocket of my coat there's a card. It's from the lawyer who handled the affairs of my house when I lost it. His name is Antonio Mendoza. Why are you telling me this? Because when this ends, I want you to go see him. Tell him that Elena Vasquez asked him to take care of you." "Elena, I don't understand." "You don't need to understand now," she said, closing her eyes for a moment. "Just promise me you'll go. Promise me you'll look for Mr. Mendoza." Matteo was confused, but the urgency in her voice convinced him it was important to her. "I promise," he said finally. Elena smiled, and for a moment, despite her pallor and weakness, she looked almost radiant. "Thank you." And Matteo, promise me one more thing. Anything. Promise me you won't let this make you bitter. Promise me you'll continue being the good man you are. The world needs more people like you. I'm not a good person, Elena. I'm just someone who has nothing else to do. You're wrong, Elena said with a firmness that contradicted her physical state. Last night, when you saw me in that doorway, you had choices. You could have kept walking. You could have ignored me like most people do. You could have thought you had your own problems and didn't need those of a stranger. She stopped to cough, a particularly violent attack that left her gasping. But you didn't do that. You saw me, you recognized me as a human being, and you decided to help. That's not accidental, Matteo. That comes from within, from who you really are. The hours passed slowly. Matteo did everything he could to keep Elena comfortable. He gave her water in small sips, adjusted the blankets to keep her warm, and kept the fire burning. But he could see she was steadily weakening. By mid-morning, Elena had drifted in and out of consciousness several times. When she was awake, sometimes she spoke clearly, telling him more stories about her previous life. Other times she seemed to be reliving conversations with her deceased husband and son. Diego, have you finished your homework? She murmured at one point, smiling as if she could see her son. Your father is waiting for you in the garage. He says today he's going to teach you how to change the car's spark plugs. Matteo felt completely helpless. Every instinct screamed at him to do something, to take her to the hospital, to seek help. But he could also see that Elena was at peace with what was happening, and something about that peace calmed him too. Matteo? Elena said weakly, around noon. I'm here. Can you tell me about your mother again? I like hearing about her. Matteo told her about Carmen. He told her how his mother sang while cooking, always old bolero songs she had learned from her own mother. He spoke of how Carmen stayed up with him when he was sick, putting cold cloths on his forehead and reading him stories until he fell asleep. She would have been proud of what you did last night, Elena murmured. Any mother would be proud of a son who helps a stranger without expecting anything in return. I wish I could believe that. Believe it, Elena said, and there was surprising strength in her weak voice. And when you get out of here, when you find your way back to the world, remember that she taught you to be good. Don't let that lesson be lost. As the afternoon progressed, Elena spent more time asleep than awake. Her breathing had become shallower, more irregular. Matteo knew the end was approaching, but he didn't know what to do with that information. He had never been with someone who was dying. When his mother died, it had been in the hospital, surrounded by machines and nurses who knew what to do. This was different. This was raw, intimate, and terrifying. But there was also something beautiful about it. Elena wasn't dying alone in a cold doorway or in a sterile hospital bed. She was surrounded by warmth, cared for by someone who had learned to love her in the course of a single night. Matteo, Elena whispered, opening her eyes one last time as the sun began to set. I'm here, Elena. Thank you, she said simply. For everything. And then, with a peaceful smile on her face, Elena Vasquez closed her eyes and stopped breathing. Matteo sat beside her for a long time, holding her hand and crying tears he didn't know he could still shed. He had known this woman for less than 24 hours, but her death felt like losing a family member. When he could finally move, he searched in the inside pocket of her coat and found the card she had mentioned. Attorney Antonio Mendoza, lawyer, was printed in elegant letters, along with an address in the city's financial district. Matteo had no idea why Elena had wanted him to contact this man, but he had made a promise, and promises to the dead were sacred. He called emergency services from a nearby payphone, and when the paramedics arrived, they confirmed what he already knew. Elena had died, probably from pneumonia complicated by exposure and malnutrition. The procedures that followed were a blur of forms, questions, and bureaucracy. Since Elena had no official identification and no known family, she would be buried in a common grave at the municipal cemetery, unless someone claimed the body and paid for a proper funeral. Matteo didn't have money for a funeral, but he couldn't bear the idea of Elena being buried as if she were nobody. Using the few dollars he had saved, he bought a small flower wreath from the cheapest stand he could find. The funeral was 3 days later. Matteo was the only person who attended, besides the hospital social worker and the minister the state provided for such occasions. The ceremony was brief and impersonal, but Matteo spoke about Elena after the minister finished. He spoke about her kindness, about her dignity, about how she had found peace even in the midst of suffering. He spoke about her previous life as a teacher, about the husband and son she had lost, about how she had ended up on the streets not because of vagrancy or vices, but because of a cruel combination of tragedy and a system that didn't care for its most vulnerable members. Elena Vasquez was a good person who deserved better than what life gave her, Mateo said to the simple wooden coffin. But even in her darkest moments, she never lost her humanity. She never lost her ability to see the good in others. After the funeral, Mateo returned to his shelter under the bridge. But the place felt empty without Elena. He could see the spot where she had slept, could remember the sound of her voice, the way she had smiled when he offered her food. For the first time in years, Mateo felt truly alone. He spent the next few days in a kind of stupor. He couldn't eat, could barely sleep. He kept expecting to hear Elena's voice, kept turning as if she would be there. The pain of her loss was different from the pain he had felt when his mother died. This was sharper, more immediate, perhaps because it had been unexpected, but there was also something else. Elena had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years, the ability to care for someone else, to feel needed, to have a purpose beyond mere survival. And he had made a promise. The lawyer's card was in his pocket, wrinkled from constant handling. Several times he had walked to the financial district, had found the building where the office was located, but hadn't managed to go in. What would he say? How would he explain his connection to Elena? But a promise was a promise, especially one made to someone on their deathbed. The fourth day after the funeral, Mateo finally gathered the courage to act. Mateo had walked those same 6 blocks for 4 consecutive days. Each morning he woke up with the determination to fulfill the promise he had made to Elena, but each time he reached the imposing glass and steel building where Attorney Mendoza's office was located, something inside him froze. It was a building that screamed success and money. The lobby had marble floors so polished he could see his distorted reflection as he walked. The security guards wore suits that probably cost more than he had seen in cash in his entire life. The people who came and went moved with that particular confidence that comes with having a place in the world. Mateo, with his torn clothes and the appearance of a man who had lived on the streets for 5 years, felt like an alien in that environment. On the 5th day after the funeral, something changed. Maybe it was the dream he had had the night before, where Elena told him with a firm voice, "A promise is a promise, Mateo. Especially those made to the dead." Or maybe it was simply that the weight of guilt had become unbearable. He showered at the park fountain, something he only did in emergencies, because it was risky and humiliating, combed his hair as best he could with his fingers, and headed to the building with a determination he hadn't felt in years. "Good morning," he told the security guard, a stocky man with suspicious eyes. "I'm here to see Attorney Mendoza." The guard looked him up and down, clearly evaluating whether he should call the police. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but this is about Elena Vasquez. She asked me to come." The name seemed to have some effect on the guard, although Mateo couldn't decipher what kind of effect. "Wait here," the guard said, heading to his desk to make a phone call. He spoke in a low voice for several minutes, casting occasional glances toward Mateo. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, the guard returned. 23rd floor. "Attorney Mendoza is expecting you." Mateo almost stumbled over his own feet. "He's expecting me," that's what they said. "The elevators are over there." The elevator ride was surreal. Mateo had never been in such a tall building, and the sensation of rising so quickly made his stomach turn. When the doors opened on the 23rd floor, he found himself facing a reception area that looked like something out of a magazine. A young, impeccably dressed woman greeted him with a professional smile that barely concealed her surprise at his appearance. "Mr. Herrera?" "Yes, that's me. Attorney Mendoza is expecting you. Please, follow me." They walked down a hallway filled with diplomas, certificates, and photographs of men in expensive suits shaking hands with other men in expensive suits. Mateo felt like he was walking through a museum of a world he had never belonged to. The secretary stopped in front of a solid wood door and knocked gently. "Come in," a voice was heard from inside. The office was exactly what Mateo had expected, enormous, elegant, with a panoramic view of the city that took your breath away. Behind a desk that seemed the size of his entire shelter, stood a man of about 60 years, gray-haired, with intelligent eyes and an expression that Mateo couldn't decipher. "Mr. Herrera, please, have a seat," said Attorney Mendoza, pointing to a leather chair that probably cost more than a used car. Mateo sat nervously on the edge of the chair, as if he were ready to run at any moment. "First of all," said the attorney, "allow me to express my condolences for the loss of Mrs. Elena. I understand that you too met under difficult circumstances. Did you know that she was—" Mateo couldn't finish the question. "On the streets?" "Yes, we knew." The attorney leaned back in his chair, studying Mateo carefully. "Mr. Herrera, what I'm about to tell you will probably seem incredible, but I need you to listen to me until the end. Mateo nodded, although his confusion was evident. Elena Vasquez was not simply an old woman who had lost her house due to debts. She was the widow of Eduardo Vasquez, owner of Vasquez Industries, one of the largest construction companies in the country. When her husband died 10 years ago, Elena inherited a considerable fortune, properties, investments, bank accounts. We're talking about approximately $50 million. Mateo felt the world tilt. That's impossible. She told me she had lost her house, that lawyers had taken it from her. Technically, that's true. But not because she didn't have money to pay for it. Elena deliberately stopped paying the bills for that specific house. It was the house where she had lived with her husband and son, and after Diego died, she couldn't stand being there. The memories were too painful. The attorney stood up and walked to the window, looking at the city that stretched below. After losing Diego, Elena fell into a severe depression. She came to my office 8 months ago with a very strange request. She wanted us to transfer all her wealth to a trust and give her access to only a small amount for basic expenses. She said she wanted to, and I quote verbatim, live like real people live, people who suffer, to understand if there's still goodness in the world. Mateo was speechless. She chose to live on the streets? Not exactly. At first, she just wanted to live in cheap apartments, in difficult neighborhoods. But something changed. She started spending more time on the streets, talking to homeless people, experiencing firsthand what it meant to have no resources. Eventually, she decided to live completely on the streets. And you let her? Elena was a very determined woman, Mr. Herrera. Legally, we couldn't stop her. She was mentally competent, and she had the right to live as she wished. But we did have instructions to keep her under discreet surveillance. The attorney returned to his desk and opened a thick file. We hired private investigators to follow her at a safe distance. They had strict orders not to intervene unless her life was in immediate danger, but to report any significant interactions she had with other people. A terrible realization began to form in Mateo's mind. Were you watching me too? The night you found Elena, our investigators were nearby. They saw everything that happened. They saw how you gave her your jacket, how you took her to your shelter, how you shared your food with her. They saw how you cared for her during her last night. Mateo felt violated, manipulated. So all this was, what? An experiment? A test? In a sense, yes, the attorney admitted. But not in the way you think. Elena wasn't testing you specifically. She had lost faith in humanity after losing her family. During months on the streets, she had found mainly cruelty, indifference, selfishness. She was beginning to believe that genuine goodness had disappeared from the world. The attorney opened a folder and took out several photographs. They were images of Mateo caring for Elena, putting the jacket on her, sharing food, keeping her warm by the fire. These photographs were taken by our investigators. But more important than the images is the report they wrote about your behavior. They said you cared for Elena as if she were your own grandmother. That you gave her everything you had without expecting anything in return. That you stayed awake all night to keep the fire burning and make sure she was comfortable. Mateo looked at the photographs, feeling strangely disconnected from the person he saw in them. Elena died in peace, the attorney continued, but before dying, she called our investigators. She told them she had found what she was looking for. She had found proof that genuine goodness still existed in the world. What does all this mean? Asked Mateo, although part of him already suspected the answer. The attorney took a thick legal document from the file. This is Elena Vasquez's last will and testament, modified 2 days before her death. Mr. Herrera, Elena has left her entire fortune to you. The words hit Mateo like a physical punch. He sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process what he had just heard. That's impossible, he finally murmured. I only knew her for a few hours. Evidently, those hours were enough to convince her of your character. How much money? Approximately $52 million in total. That includes properties, investments, bank accounts, and the income they've generated during the last 8 months. Mateo stood up abruptly from the chair, walking to the window as if he needed fresh air. I can't accept this. It's too much. I didn't do anything special. I was just kind to an old woman. Exactly, said the attorney. That's precisely what convinced her. In a world where most people would have walked past a dying old woman on the streets, you stopped. Not because you expected a reward, not because you thought she had money, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Mateo turned to face the attorney. There has to be a catch. A condition. Something. The attorney smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. There is a condition. Elena wrote a letter for you. I think it would be better if you read it before we continue. He handed him a sealed envelope with his name written in Elena's trembling but elegant handwriting. With shaking hands, Matteo opened the envelope and began to read. My dear Matteo, if you're reading this, it means my plan worked, and Attorney Mendoza has fulfilled my instructions. I want you to understand something fundamental. You weren't chosen at random. During 8 months living on the streets, I met dozens of people. Some were good, others not so much, but most were simply struggling to survive, just like me. But you were different. In my last hours, you gave me what my money could never buy, genuine compassion without expectations. You didn't know who I was, you didn't know if I had anything to offer you in return. You helped me simply because I needed help. This isn't charity, Matteo. This is justice. The world needs more people like you in positions where they can make a real difference. Now, about the condition, I want you to use this fortune to help others like us. People who have fallen through the cracks of the system, who have been forgotten by a society that measures human value in terms of economic productivity. But I don't want you to simply donate money. I want you to use your experience, your understanding of what it really means to have nothing, to create something better. Shelters that treat people with dignity. Programs that give people not just food and shelter, but hope and opportunities. And most importantly, I want you to always remember that a person's true value isn't in what they possess, but in what they're willing to give when they have nothing to give. Don't fail me, Matteo. But more importantly, don't fail yourself. Your mother raised you well. Honor her memory. With all my love and gratitude, Elena. P.S. In the mansion's attic you'll find my diaries. Read them when you're ready. They'll help you understand why I chose this path. When Matteo finished reading, he had tears running down his cheeks. The attorney offered him a box of tissues and waited patiently for him to compose himself. Are you ready to talk about the practical aspects? The attorney finally asked. Matteo nodded, although he felt like he was floating outside his body. For the next 2 hours, Attorney Mendoza explained the details of his new financial situation. There were properties in 3 different cities, including the mansion where Elena had lived with her family. There were investments in government bonds, stocks, and real estate that generated passive income of approximately $200,000 per month. $200,000 a month. Matteo repeated, incredulous. That's correct. Elena was very conservative with her investments. She prioritized long-term stability over quick profits. I earn that amount. Well, I don't earn anything. But when I worked, I earned that amount in 3 years. I understand this is overwhelming, said the attorney. That's why I suggest we start gradually. We can set up a checking account with sufficient funds for your immediate needs, and then work on a long-term plan to manage the rest. Can I refuse it? Matteo asked suddenly. If this is too much for me, can I just say no? The attorney looked at him with surprise. Technically, yes. But may I ask why you would consider doing that? Because I don't deserve this. There are people who have worked their entire lives and will never have even a fraction of this amount. Why me? Why someone who's been a failure for 5 years? A failure? The attorney leaned back in his chair. Mr. Herrera, do you know how many people walk past needy individuals every day? How many people see suffering and choose to ignore it because it's easier? That doesn't make me special. It just makes me, I don't know, normal. Exactly. You're special because you're normal. Because in a world that has become cynical and selfish, you maintained your basic humanity. Elena recognized that. The attorney stood up and walked to a wall covered with photographs. Do you see these photos? They're my clients who have inherited family fortunes. Most never worked a day in their lives, never knew hardship, never understood what it means to struggle. Do you think they deserve their money more than you? Matteo didn't respond, but the point was clear. Elena believed you would do something significant with this opportunity. But the decision is yours. That night, for the first time in 5 years, Matteo slept in a real bed. The attorney had insisted on booking him a room at a decent hotel while he decided what to do next. It was a middle-class hotel, nothing extravagant, but for someone who had slept on the ground for half a decade, it felt like a palace. He stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. Every time he started to convince himself that it had all been a dream, he looked at the bank card the attorney had given him, with his name printed in golden letters. The next morning, he decided to visit Elena's mansion. It was a huge house in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, surrounded by perfectly maintained gardens and a wrought iron fence that seemed more decorative than functional. When the taxi dropped him off at the entrance, Mateo stood for several minutes, simply looking. An older man, impeccably dressed, approached from the house. "Mr. Herrera? I'm Fernando Salazar, butler of the Vasquez family. We've been expecting you." "Expecting me?" "Attorney Mendoza informed us that you would come. Please, allow me to show you the house." The house was even more impressive inside than outside. High ceilings, antique furniture, works of art that probably were worth more than everything Mateo had owned in his life. But what struck him most was that it felt like a home, not like a museum. There were family photographs everywhere, books that had clearly been read, furniture that showed the wear patterns of daily use. Mrs. Elena loved this house, Fernando said as they walked through the main living room. But after losing Mr. Diego, she couldn't be here anymore. She said every room reminded her of what she had lost. "Did you know her well?" "I worked for the Vasquez family for 35 years. I saw Mr. Diego grow up from a child." Mrs. Elena was, it's hard to explain. She was a woman of great heart who blamed herself for tragedies that were beyond her control. Fernando took him to the attic, where Elena had mentioned her diaries would be. It was a large, bright room, full of neatly labeled boxes and shelves full of books. "These are Mrs. Elena's diaries," Fernando said, pointing to a series of leather notebooks arranged chronologically on an antique desk. "She started writing after Mr. Eduardo died, and continued until the end." Mateo took the last diary, dated only days before Elena died. The final entry was written in trembling but determined handwriting. "I have found what I was looking for. His name is Mateo Herrera, he's 23 years old, and he has lived on the streets for 5 years after losing his mother. But more important than his story is his heart. Tonight, when I needed it most, he gave me everything he had. His jacket, his food, his shelter, his company. Not because he expected something in return, but simply because he saw another human being in need. I have decided that he will be my heir. Not because I think he needs to be saved, but because I believe he can save others. He has lived the life that I could only experience for 8 months. He understands pain, desperation, invisibility. But more importantly, he has maintained his goodness despite everything. My last wish is that he use this fortune to create something beautiful from the pain that we have both known. Shelters that treat people as human beings. Programs that give hope in addition to food. A support network for those the world has forgotten. Tomorrow I will call Attorney Mendoza to change my will. I don't know how much time I have left, but I know I have found the right person." Mateo closed the diary and sat in silence for a long time. Fernando had left discreetly, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For the first time since receiving the news, Mateo began to truly understand what Elena had done. She hadn't just given him money, she had given him a purpose. She had given him the opportunity to transform his pain into something meaningful. He stood up and walked to the attic window, which overlooked the back garden. He could imagine Elena sitting in that same chair, writing about her pain, her loss, her search for meaning in a world that seemed to have lost compassion. That afternoon, Mateo returned to Attorney Mendoza's offices with a decision. "I accept the inheritance," he said without preamble. "But I want to do things correctly. I want to honor Elena's memory the way she wanted." The attorney smiled. "I hoped you would say that. Do you have specific ideas about how you want to proceed?" "Yes. I want to establish the Elena Vasquez Foundation. But not just to give money. I want to create shelters that really work. Places where people can not only sleep and eat, but receive job training, psychological counseling, help finding permanent housing. That's going to require a lot of planning and resources. I have time and, apparently, I have resources. What I need is help to do it correctly." During the following weeks, Mateo immersed himself in planning. He hired consultants, visited existing shelters, spoke with social workers and charitable organizations. But more importantly, he returned to the streets to talk with people he knew, to understand what kind of help they really needed. "Mateo?" The voice belonged to Carlos, a middle-aged man he had known during his second year on the streets. "What are you doing dressed like that?" Mateo was wearing new but simple clothes, nothing extravagant. He had discovered that gradual changes were easier to handle. "It's a long story, Carlos. But I'm here because I need your help." He told Carlos and others about his plans for the foundation. He didn't mention the exact amount of money involved, but explained that he had received a significant donation and wanted to use it to create something that would really help. "Most shelters treat us like cattle," said Maria, a woman he had known for years. "They give us a bed and soup, but they make us feel like we're a burden." "What would be different?" asked Mateo. "Dignity," Carlos replied immediately. "Being treated like people, not like problems. During the following months, Matteo worked tirelessly to create not just shelters, but comprehensive support centers. The first one opened a year after Elena's death, in a renovated building in the city center. It wasn't just a place to sleep. It had private dormitories, not communal bunks. It had a kitchen where residents could prepare their own meals. It had classrooms for job training, offices for counseling, and a staff that had been specifically trained to treat each resident as an individual with dignity and potential. But most importantly, Matteo had insisted that the staff include people who had experienced homelessness themselves. People who understood, who didn't judge, who could offer hope because they had lived it. On the day of the inauguration, Matteo stood outside the building, watching as people he had known on the streets entered with expressions of cautious hope. "I think Mrs. Elena would be proud," said Fernando, who had insisted on attending the ceremony. "I hope so," Matteo replied. But this is just the beginning. In the years that followed, the Elena Vasquez Foundation expanded to other cities. They opened not just shelters, but job training centers, mental health clinics, and transitional housing programs. Matteo was personally involved in every aspect, using his experience on the streets to ensure that each program addressed real needs. But perhaps most meaningful to him was the program they developed for families. They had learned that many people became homeless after medical bankruptcies, job losses, or family tragedies, situations that could happen to anyone. "No one is more than 2 paychecks away from being on the streets," Matteo often said in interviews. The difference between being stable and being homeless is smaller than most people realize. 5 years after Elena's death, Matteo found himself back at the bridge where he had built his original shelter. He had returned occasionally over the years, but this day was special. It was the anniversary of the night he had met Elena. The space under the bridge was different now. The city had converted it into a small memorial park, with a plaque that read, "In memory of those who are homeless, and in honor of those who choose to help." Matteo hadn't requested the memorial, but when community members learned about his story and the foundation's work, they had petitioned the city to create it. "I thought I might find you here." Matteo turned around to see Fernando approaching, carrying a small bouquet of flowers. "Every year," Fernando explained, placing the flowers near the plaque. Mrs. Elena loved flowers, especially simple ones. They stood in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. "Do you ever wonder if she planned all this?" asked Fernando eventually. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Elena was very intelligent, very strategic. "Sometimes I wonder if she intentionally put herself in a position where she would meet someone like you." Matteo had wondered the same thing many times. "Do you think it matters?" "No," Fernando said after thinking about it. "What matters is that you two found each other when you both needed it most. She needed to rediscover hope, and you needed to rediscover purpose." That night, Matteo returned to the mansion that was now legally his home, although he had kept it exactly as Elena had left it. In the study, he pulled out one of his own journals. He had started writing after reading Elena's diaries, finding that it helped him process everything that had happened. He wrote, "5 years ago, I was a man who had given up on life. I survived each day, but I wasn't really living. I thought my story had ended when I lost my mother and my home. Elena showed me that sometimes what looks like an ending is really a beginning. She taught me that compassion isn't just about helping others, it's about recognizing our shared humanity, our mutual vulnerability. The foundation has helped thousands of people, but I think she saved me more than I ever saved anyone else. She gave me back my purpose, my hope, my belief that good things can come from terrible pain." Tomorrow we're opening our 10th location. We've helped more than 5,000 people find permanent housing, jobs, treatment for addiction and mental illness. But more than that, we've shown them, and myself, that they matter, that they deserve dignity and respect and love. I think about my mother often, wondering if she would be proud of who I've become. I believe she would be. And I know Elena is. The money changed my circumstances, but meeting Elena changed my soul. And that, I think, was exactly what she intended. As he closed the journal, Matteo reflected on how dramatically his life had changed, not just externally but internally. The man who had lived under the bridge had been broken, hopeless, convinced that he had nothing to offer the world. But Elena had seen something different. She had seen potential for goodness, for leadership, for healing, both his own and others. And by believing in him when he couldn't believe in himself, she had given him the greatest gift possible, a reason to keep living, and a way to make sure his suffering hadn't been meaningless. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, covering the city in a blanket of white. Matteo thought about all the people who would sleep outside tonight, and felt grateful that at least some of them would have warm, safe places to go thanks to Elena's legacy. But more than that, he felt grateful for the lesson she had taught him, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply see another person's humanity and respond to it with kindness. Everything else, the money, the foundation, the programs, all of that was just the result of that simple, fundamental truth. Elena had been right. Goodness did still exist in the world. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you got the chance to help it grow. Incredible. Didn't I tell you this ending would move you to tears? This story proves that miracles do exist, and that kindness always finds a way to multiply. Matteo didn't just change his life, but changed the lives of thousands of people. What did you think of this epic twist? Did you imagine that Elena was a millionaire? Comment your favorite part, subscribe if you want more stories that restore your faith in humanity, and share this story with everyone who needs to remember that one act of kindness can change the entire world. What would you do if you received an inheritance like this? Leave us your answers in the comments.